Welcome, everybody. I'm John Haskell, Director of the Kluge Center. Let me introduce Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Bulgaria, Lyubomir Goncharov. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this event, and thank you for the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor and a real pleasure for me to open this event and to speak in front of these distinguished guests. And to open this event with the participation of Ivan Krastev, who is one of the most prominent experts on Balkan and European affairs. He is also a chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia and a permanent fellow at the Human Science Institute in Vienna. He is the first Bulgarian to be a chair, Henry Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress in Foreign Policy and International Relations. This event is co-hosted by the Bulgarian Embassy in Washington, D.C. and the delegation of the European Union. And it is also a part of the Month of European Culture, which highlights the culture of the 28 member states of the European Union. It is even more symbolic that it is happening today, because today is 9th of May, and as you are aware, this is Europe Day. Probably many of you know this. And on this day, we commemorate the declaration of then French Foreign Minister Schuman, who announced in the declaration and proposed the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community. And that was one of the first endeavors which led to the creation of the European Union as it exists nowadays. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you once again to John Haskell and Travis, who organized this event, and thanks once again.
Thank you. I want to point out that we have been proud to have Mr. Krastev in residence here at the library. He is the first Bulgarian, as pointed out, to be the Kissinger Chair in International Relations and Foreign Policy. He has set up events, done a lot of writing, and has become a real force here in his extended residence in Washington. The Kluge Center here at the library is proud to co-sponsor the event with the European Delegation and the Embassy of Bulgaria. At the Kluge Center, we bring renowned scholars into residence to do research in the library collections and project and promote cutting-edge scholarship addressing important public questions in events just like this one. Let me say one or two other things about Mr. Krastev that haven't already been mentioned. He is, as probably a lot of you know, a regular columnist in the New York Times. I recommend all of you to hit the archives if you want to know what's been going on lately in Europe and follow him going forward. He's the author of Democracy Disrupted, The Politics of Global Protest. That's in your program. But he's also the author of, he's completing a book project here at the Kluge Center in the library with Stephen Holmes. And the title, I think, is The Light That Failed. Are you sticking with that title?
Yeah.
So far? Yeah, okay. He's open to suggestion, I think.
But it's not electricity issue.
Yeah. So let's begin the conversation. A little background, because a lot of us have been reading you in the New York Times, and we don't know anything about you. I happen to have a little more insight since you've been down the hall from me many of the last few months here at the Kluge Center. Where were you educated? Who inspired you? What got you interested in politics in Europe?
So, thank you very much. First, it was real privilege and pleasure, and the pleasure was even more than privilege, being part of the Kluge Center. It was absolutely amazing, and if it was not for this fellowship, this light that was failing was never going to be there, probably. They're not going to be light at all. Secondly, about these personal stories, Bulgaria is an Orthodox country. We are not famous for confessing. The difference between the Catholics and the Orthodox is that Catholics confess in church, Orthodox only in police, and only after being interrogated. But saying this, in an important way, I do believe that I represent something that you're going to call the generation of 1989. I was born in 1965 in a small town in Bulgaria, Vukovic, which probably nobody of you know, but I have spent most of my life in Bulgaria. And in 1989, I was the last year student in the Sofia University, basically graduating philosophy. And this was a very interesting time. In fact, the late 1980s was extremely interesting time in Bulgaria. First, it was very much intellectual. The changes that started in the Soviet Union were extremely important. Basically, people were reading and talking differently. Sofia University in 1980s was very different than 1950s. There was a very important change of generations of professors and others. And from this point of view, we have been probably the luckiest generation from this point of view. And then in 1991, I was also very lucky to get a fellowship to go to Oxford on one of the Soros fellowships. We had been together with current Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban there, and basically stayed for a year in St. Anthony's College. And then a person who had a very strong kind of an academic influence of me was the then warden of the college, the German professor Ralph Dahrendorf. And Dahrendorf was quite important because I do believe 1989, 1990, 1991 was very different being East European. I don't know how it was in Washington, but in Oxford or in any big cities. Because then everybody was interested in Eastern Europe. Now it's very different. I remember then, when I was in Oxford, I was complaining to a famous German professor. I said, listen, there is something very unfair. In the last 10 years, you're going to have at least 20 dissertations in Oxford being defended on Poland, and you don't have a single one on Bulgaria. And he looked to me very kind of surprising and said, but do you know what? Poland is a career. Bulgaria is just a hobby. And from this point of view, but there was this kind of an excitement, and we had the feeling that what we have been doing was very important. Intellectual, so also for me was a very important, a person that I have met only once, and he was very much in his late age, and this is the German-American social scientist Albert Hirschman. And I have been very much kind of influenced by his writing, and I do believe. But I was one of the luckiest person to meet really very interesting and kind people, and even the fact that I was here, this luck of mine continues.
So you mentioned 1989, and I know in your writings you cite that as a key turning point in Europe. Everybody knows that. But you talk about it in a way that is certainly not as hopeful as it seemed at the time. What do you mean? Why did things go sour?
There is because last year in the summer, the Bertelsmann Foundation did a big study in all EU member states, and it discovered that nostalgia is one of the major kind of feeling that we have. 67% of Europeans declared that the world was better before. And everybody, this level of nostalgia was as kind of popular among those who were in their late 30s than in their late 70s. The only problem was when before. And we start discussing, and there is a very famous Bulgarian writer, Georgi Gospodinov, who is now working on a novel, and the plot of the novel is the following. European leaders cannot agree on the common future. So they decided that we should agree in which year we want to go back. But the only story is that we should basically find a year in which everybody is going to live in their own country. Because some years that have been good for some were not so much good for others. And paradoxically, I do believe if you're going to have such a plot, the year we're going to come with is going to be 1989, not because it was the richest, but because the level of hope was very high everywhere. And from this point of view, what we're doing in this book with Stephen Holmes, which we finished and which is going to be published by Penguin in October, is very much trying to look back and to try to see why this great hope and expectations basically look very differently when you look from this 30 years perspective. And one of the major arguments which we're making in the book is that if you go back to famous Fukuyama, The End of History, The end of history was also the age of imitation. In a certain way, what was important for the revolution of 1989 was that the keyword of 1989 revolution was normality. People said, we don't need new ideas anymore. We basically want to have a normal life. And the normal life was the life in the West. But this idea that basically the future is going to be simply imitating the West has, in my view, three important impacts that we now start to see differently. The first is, when you imitate somebody, it means that you basically accept your own inferiority. So if the world before was divided between democracy, authoritarianism, in 1989 it was divided between the imitated and the imitators. And the role of the imitator is a very strange one, because on one level you want to be like somebody else. But on the other, the very fact that you want to be somebody else creates a problem for your own identity. And I do believe this is one of the stories that you see in Central and Eastern Europe these days. Part of the problems that we have are very typical for the second generation of migrants in Europe, where the first generation goes, it's very much excited about being integrated in other community, but the second generation said, what about me, about my tradition? And plus, the model is there and all the time is telling you how well you're doing. The second thing which is important was that after every revolution, there is a major movement of people. Go back to history, but normally this is the defeated party that is living. Go back to the French Revolution and you're going to see the white French living. Go back to the Russian Revolution and you're going to see the white Russians living. The paradox of 1989 was that it was the liberal revolution, but the first to leave the country were the liberals. For a very kind of a natural reason, because basically, revolutionary wants to live in the future. And the future was just next to you in space. So if the future of Poland is Germany, why do you wait basically Poland to become like Germany when you can go to Germany? You can go work, study, doing things, and coming back and forth. And I do believe this is very important, but it has one important side effect, which is probably the least discussed thing about the last 30 years concerning Central and Eastern Europe. With the exception of the two Central and East European countries, one of the important things that happened in Central and Eastern Europe was a major emigration of people from the East to the West. Depopulation of Central and Eastern Europe is something that I do believe is going to be something to be discussed in the years to come, and this was not very much part of our analysis. Just to give you some figures in order to understand what I'm talking about. For these last years, and particularly after our countries entered the European Union, and don't forget, opening of the borders is the best thing that happened if you're going to ask people what is the most important thing that has changed. But as a result of it, the Baltic republics basically lost almost 1/3 of their population. Bulgaria lost between 20 to 25% of its population. Just between 2007 and 2017, 3.4 million Romanians have left the country. And 70% of them are younger than 40. Just for the last 3 years, 10,000 medical doctors has left Romania. When I'm giving you these figures, because on one level, you have this opening of the borders, and people basically see the possibility to travel, and all of us, the very fact that I'm here, for the last 10 years I have been teaching in Vienna, is part of this openness. From the point of view of the people who are there, this major exodus of people has three important consequences to be taken seriously. One is economic. This is a major change of the labor market, because we're talking about the small societies, aging societies. It's one thing if you have 8 children, 4 of them to emigrate. It's totally different if you have 1 or 2 children. So as a result of it, you come with a situation in which, in many of our countries these days, basically, you have a major shortage of labor. The second thing that happened is that, and this is also economically important, not simply people are leaving, but all the money that has been invested in their education has been living with them. So this kind of a transfer of money from the East to the West. An Italian colleague of mine basically has been calculating that we're talking about 200 billion euros for these 30 years, the money that have been invested in the education of the people that have left.
Did people in Western Europe who were looking to promote, of course, liberal institutions, did they do anything wrong?
Listen,
could they have done anything at the time to have made a difference? Or was this something that couldn't have been anticipated?
the most important thing is that, and this is part of the paradox of the European Union, European Union is in crisis not because of its failures, but because of its successes, honestly speaking. Opening of the borders, creating the single place, the possibility that people can travel and be together, this was the success. But the success always has two sides. And from this point of view, even politically, when people are saying what happened to the liberal parties, where the liberal voters, they're in Berlin, they're in Paris. Look at the Romanian elections in which the Romanian president was elected 4 years ago simply because 300,000 Romanians living out of Romania disproportionately high voted for him. So this is the paradox. The paradox is that the best and the worst is the same. People can talk failures here and there, for sure. Probably certain type of a policy could be different. But I do believe, and this is the different in our book, basically, than many others, which are trying just to see where exactly was the failure. It was slightly more complicated because the success, all this movement was very much in itself, having also part of the self-destructive characteristics that we see and which we basically experience these days. For example, you cannot say that, for example, the West was pushing East European societies to imitate it. It was a kind of a demand for imitation. This was basically us that say, this is how we want to organize our society. But this does not explain the fact that, of course, at some point, after for 10, 15 years, you're expecting to start to live like the Germans or French. It didn't happen. Then people start asking totally different questions. Why didn't it happen? Why it worked this way or that way? And this creates resentment. And of course, this resentment is different from countries to countries. But one of my major arguments is people now try to explain many of the problems, particularly with certain type of a liberal turn in some of the Central and East European countries. They try to find the economic explanations. And listen, economy is very important. Of course, there are losers and winners in any economic development. But if you just look at the economic statistics, you are not going to get Poland and to explain what is happening. For the last 15 years, Poland is the best performing economy in Europe. They didn't have a recession in 2008, 2009, 2010. For these last 10 years, the social inequality in Poland has been decreased and not increased. So from this point of view, the classical explanation with social inequality does not work. And secondly, everybody who has been visiting the country for these years, this is a very much changed country. This is a changed country. So if we want to understand what is happening, the economic explanation is not going to be enough. Adam Przeworski, one of the famous scholar of democracy, when he was asked how he's going to explain the illiberal turn in Poland, he said, theoretically speaking, this should not have happened. And this is it. If you simply go on the level of the institutional performance, on the level of voting patterns. So obviously, we are talking about something else. And psychological element, cultural element are becoming critically important. Also, there is one problem with imitation, which is very, very important. It's one thing to imitate God. It's totally different to imitate your neighbor. And by the way, you're imitating society, but this society is changing all the time. For example, many conservative polls are saying, listen, we like the West so much because in the West they love God and they go to church and this was very traditional society, and now we ask basically to imitate societies that are very different. And this is also true. Societies are changing, and you're all the time trying to imitate. This is like with the iPhones. You always should have the last version because the previous are not available. They don't work. So I do believe this is very important because there is one joke that I have promised that I'm going to tell, because when we have been discussing here, people said, listen, what you're going to say is not very interesting anyway, so be sure that there's going to be one joke. And this joke for me is very important because methodologically I do believe it is important. Now, with the rise of populism in many places in Europe and outside of Europe,
Before you get to the joke, so Poland's done really well. Have they had less emigration?
No, listen, the countries that have a very small emigration is the Czech Republic, only 4%. And I was trying for myself to try to come with the explanation. Unfortunately, this is speculations. I never went on the figures, but I do believe we're going to see quite high correlations between the level of urbanization of the country before the communists came to power and the level of immigration. And I'm going to give you why it's part of my, my argument. If you see how easily and how readily most of us basically see going outside of the country as a type of the social promotion, this is very similar to some of the things that you can see 60s and 70s when people have been moving from the villages to the towns. So from this point of view, you have the previous generation, particularly in the countries with a strong rural population, which have been convinced, and it was part of also ideological, that basically living in a city, the very fact that you're living in a city makes you more important, basically, than living. Because there are people who are living for economic reasons, and there are people who are living just because they want to get a better education, more interesting work. So from this point of view, it's very kind of also wrong to try to get all the people that are living under the same with the same explanation. And secondly, most of the people are living with the idea that they're going to come back. Some of them are coming back. So this is a much more important story. But for me, this is Poland that a lot of Poles are living. But don't forget 1990s were difficult in Poland with high levels of unemployment. The country which also has a relatively low immigration is Slovenia. So from this point of view, you're not going to have a correlations between economic success and emigration. For example, the Baltic republics economically has achieved a lot. But if you're going to see to some of the kind of percent of the people who emigrate, you're going to see a very high percentage. So from this point of view, economy cannot explain only. And also, living in a small country, particularly if you're a young person, you want to have a different experience. You just want to try something different. Try to see, basically, you have the feeling that you know what is around. So also for different generations in these 30 years, probably the reason was different.
So
and the joke, and
yeah.
now comes the joke. And the joke is why we should not put all the countries together. And the joke is a Swiss joke. They're not member of the European Union, but the day of Europe also concerns them. So Swiss jokes also could be told. And this is a joke about 3 boys, 8, 9-year-old. The German boy, the French boy, and the Swiss boy, and they're discussing where the babies come from. And the German boy said, do you know what, as I know from my parents, the babies are coming from the sky, and the parents find them in front of the doors. And the French boy started laughing immediately, said, this is not true, they're coming from the bedroom. But then the Swiss boy became very nervous. And he said, do not generalize. It's different from canton to canton. And I don't know is it true about babies, but it's very much true about explanation for certain type of political turns in the countries. The countries that can end up on the same place, the reasons why they're there could be very different. And the way they went there could be very different.
So that you brought up the point about nostalgia, and recently you wrote that there's an epidemic of nostalgia, and you describe nostalgia as a disease, kind of a melancholia, and you said the epidemic of nostalgia, that Europe's paradox, I'll start that one again. Europe's paradox is that Europeans are united in their belief that the world was better yesterday, but they are divided as to when that golden age was. So how does that differ by country? Or can you dive a little deeper into that? You started into it.
No, this differs very much by country. I was part of a big electoral survey that European Council for Foreign Relations did 2 months ago. And it was interesting to see this kind of what I'm going to say now, for me, is very important to understand at least where I see the problem of Europe today. European project was very much a project started by societies that feared their past. There was society coming from wars. The World War was very destructive, and in a certain way, you have political leaders who basically said, we need a future that is not going to basically look like the past. What we see in Europe today is very much societies that fear the future. There are different reasons for this. One is also demography. You have a kind of aging and shrinking populations. Secondly, of course, Europe is not as important as it was. in a certain way, if you go 50 years ago or 100 years ago, this was going to be more important. Thirdly, and this is very important, and I'm sure that people who are doing basically European Union know very much about this. After the end of the Cold War and 10 years ago, in Europe there was a feeling that, yes, we're not at the center of the world in the way we have been before, but we're the laboratory of the world to come. The idea of a kind of a post-sovereign states, the different level of security based on economic interdependence, this was something that what makes Europeans to believe that nevertheless that we are not the major theater in which the future is going to be decided, but we're really the place where others are heading. In the last 10 years, Europeans basically we started to ask questions to what extent it's true. If you look around, China, India, Brazil, but even the United States, there is not this post-sovereignty drive that we believed is there. And I do believe all this, combined with the aging population, created a situation in which a lot of people, as I told you, 67% in Europe start to believe that the world was better yesterday. But when was yesterday? If you look to some of the populist parties, basically you're going to see that part of the yesterday is going to be, and by the way, this yesterday does not need to exist, because we like most of the things that we have imagined that they have been there. But the idea of a kind of a much more cohesive, also much more ethnically homogeneous societies is very much where you're going to see a lot of nostalgia going on. And particularly in the West. In the East, this is not a nostalgia for the communist period, to be honest. Even when people are going there, they can like certain parts of it. They don't want the package back. But there are a lot of people on the other side, on the left, which are going to be very much nostalgic for the progressive decades of the 1990s. So in a certain way, they're very different, but most of them are much more trying to return something that have been there before. And from this point of view, if you're going to see kind of the relations to the future is much more problematic. We are not so self-confident about the future. I don't believe this is only a European phenomenon. I do believe that you can see also in the United States. I do believe probably it's different in Asia, but this is something that I found quite important.
So let's look at the elections for the European Parliament that are coming up, and people who follow in passing, I guess, European politics, a lot of us, we haven't necessarily focused on the European parliamentary elections. They've been kind of low profile, but it's different this time, it seems like. So what's going on?
The right answer on what is going on is where. Because the problem is that Europe is big. And the story of the European elections was always that they were much more kind of a national phenomenon. And when people were voting, they're very much voting in a certain national context. Of course, this year is different for three reasons. First, for the first time, the European Union cannot be taken for granted. And people basically look around and said how important it's going to be. Secondly, and this is the second kind of a strange story, is that not so much that people are voting just on an issue that is central for Europe, but people are much more interested in the other Europeans. This is one of the effects of the crisis. Paradoxically, first as a result of the financial crisis, Germans became a specialist on Greek economy. And then as a result of the refugee crisis, Hungarians and Poles became a specialist on the German asylum policies. And as a result of it, suddenly you start to be interested in others and you start to understand that we are much more related than before. And also what is becoming for the first time a new phenomena is that there was always a Eurosceptic and protest vote in Europe. Even more on the European elections, this vote is always overrepresented. One of the surprise for people who are going to say that there's going to be a big rise of the support for the Eurosceptic parties, it's not going to be a big rise because they did well on the previous elections too. There is almost 30% of the members of European Parliament which are on the right of the center-right. But they are four different parties. The Eurosceptic parties and the far right has never been the unified force. They have been on islands. Everybody basically was fighting Europe on their own context. For the first time on these elections, you have an attempt to have a much more organized and unified Eurosceptic bloc. And at the same time, what is happening is that while this is a reality, and I do believe that some of the political leaders will try to make their best to come with the Eurosceptic group being the biggest in the next European Parliament, at least for several weeks, to have the symbolic victory in this. But what is also interesting is that two things changed also dramatically. When the elections were coming, you have two strategies. One coming from pro-European progressive camp, very much articulated by President Macron, and he said, this is going to be a referendum on the European Union, and he basically imagined the European elections to look like the second round of the presidential elections in France, where he defeated Marine Le Pen. To be honest, this is not going to happen like this, for a very simple reason. As a result of his defeat of Marine Le Pen and as a result of Brexit, in Europe today, do not have a major European party that is openly advocating for leaving the European Union. This is the paradox of the European skepticism. Unlike 2 years ago, when you have basically 15 parties in Europe that have been asking for the referendums for exiting the EU, the success of Brexit was that now basically nobody wants to leave the European Union, only everybody wants to change it. On the other side, basically the strategy of the far right was that the referendum is going to be, that the elections are going to be a referendum on migration, and to be honest, on the failure of the European Union to do is migration. This is also not going to work, not because migration is not an issue. This is an issue in most of the countries, but there are three things that happen meanwhile. First, the number of the migrants in Europe has dramatically declined. Basically, for the last year, there are around 120,000 people who entered the European Union, which is a big entity of 500 million people. This is the number of tourists that land in the Athens airport in a single day in August. So this is, by the way, the difference between Europe and America. Here the administration talks a lot about migration, but migration is increasing. In our case, basically, there was a decrease. And this was dramatic because the refugee crisis was very much created to a very specific fact, and this was the Syrian war. The second thing that happened is that you do not have a major, in the way you don't have a major party on the right that is openly asking for leaving the European Union, basically on the left and center left, you don't have a major party that is advocating open borders. Strengthening the external borders is a commonplace, and you're going to see President Macron and others basically also speaking very much about it. So this is a new situation in which you have a much more unified Eurosceptic bloc, so-called Europe of Nations, and they're basically leaving European Union is not on their agenda, but they do believe that they can take control of the Union. And on the other side, basically, you have a kind of a new pro-European majority, which is consisting of almost anybody else, which also basically works differently than it was looking before. So from this point of view, it's going to be interesting, and I do believe that Europe is going to be different, European Union, than the one we knew for the last 20 years. This is not a good news or bad news because European Union has been changing a lot all the time, so you're changing. But there's three things that in my view changed a lot, because I could be wrong, and I'm sure that in the room there are people who know much more about this than me. But if you look at European projects, there are three different projects there. And all of them kind of succeeded but went into a crisis. First, Europe was a post-war project. Post-1945, we are 3 generations after the war, and psychologists always claim that any trauma cannot survive more than 3 generations. Nevertheless, how are you institutionalizing? How are you basically teaching people? But secondly, what is also important is that because of a much more diverse nature of European societies today, when you talk to a Syrian refugee in Germany and you say war, what comes to his mind is not World War II. So this type of a common memory, which basically the war means everything for everybody, is not true anymore. And certainly European Union was a post-war project in a much more profound sense. Europeans, we managed to convince ourselves that military power does not work anymore, at least in Europe. The pacification of European mind is one of the miracles for the last 50 or 60 years. Europeans can be defined differently, but for centuries we were not famous for being peace lovers. And then suddenly, there was this famous book, Where Has All Soldiers Gone? So it's not only about military budgets. Suddenly you have a major pacification of European mind, and this is why, for example, the Ukrainian crisis struck Europe so strongly, because we said we know that war exists and the hard power matters, but why in Europe? And then some of our major assumptions started to be challenged. For example, economic interdependence. Can economic interdependence be enough? They give the soft power. So this is a crisis. The second European project was post-1968 Europe. And this was very much the Europe of rights. And this was very much connected to decolonization, new generation. And the language of rights was very important, but the rights was very much about the rights of individuals and rights of minorities. If you see the new populist parties, they speak the language of rights, but it's the rights of majorities. And very much, basically, you have the phenomena of threatened majorities. Majority groups which, for different reasons, could be demographic, could be political, start to perceive themselves as the future minorities. And the third Europe was the post-1989 Europe, and this was the East-West divide. And on this, I just want to make one point, which for me is important, because you know that East-West divide was very much also discussed during the refugee crisis, where basically in Eastern Europe, you have a very kind of a hostile reactions to the refugees, nevertheless there was not refugees. One of the major differences between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, if you look at the map, the ethnic maps, is just put together two ethnic maps, one from the 1900 and one of today. In 1900, there were two Europes. One was ethnically quite homogeneous, and this was Western Europe, Germany, France. The other was very ethnically diverse and culturally diverse, and this was Central Europe, the Habsburg lands. And then comes the World War II, destruction, expulsion of the population, ethnic cleansing. By the way, it was not done by Central Europeans. It was done on them, by the Germans, by the Soviets. As a result of it, in the year 1939, 1/3 of the population of Poland were not ethnic Poles. There were Germans, there were Jews, there were Ukrainians. Now, more than 96% of the population of Poland are ethnic Poles. So suddenly, basically, the difference between ethnic diversity and ethnic homogeneity changed places. And it changed places so big, just give you two countries which are next to each other with a very similar history, Hungary and Austria. At the moment, more than 14% of the citizens of Austria were not born in Austria. This is a higher percent than the United States. 50% of all students in the Vienna schools do not have a German as a first language. On the other side, only 4% of the citizens of Hungary have not been born in Hungary, and most of them are Hungarians being born in Romania or in Serbia. So this type of a different experience, and don't keep in mind also that when it comes to diversity and differences, most of the Western countries and Western democracies are former colonial empires that have a lot of encounters with others. None of East European countries are. 1968 in the Western Europe was very much about the rights of individuals. In Eastern Europe, it was about self-determination and the rights of nations. Czechoslovaks against the Soviets, Poles. So these cultural differences coming back, and from this point of view, basically, post-1989 Europe, of course, is culturally much more diverse on the level of experience than the Cold War Europe, and I do believe that now we are trying to struggle to reconcile these differences.
So the gist of a lot of what you said is that the demographic challenges, or I don't know if that's really the right word, the demographic issues anyway, are animating the politics.
Very much.
So what's that say about the parliamentary elections? What matters about the elections? What should we look for? Are there key countries? Yeah. We say to say broadly, hey, there's much more interest in it is different than saying
yeah.
Obviously you can't predict what's going to happen because you say everybody's a swing voter.
Yeah.
You can go there if you want, but 70% are swing voters.
Yeah.
Why might this matter?
Yeah. Okay, let's first give you the swing voter figures. ECFR survey basically figured out the following. 50% of the people said we are not voting, which is normal. The electoral turnout on the European elections usually is lower than in the national elections. Out of this 50%, 15 said that they are undecided for whom they are going to vote. 35% said we know for whom we're going to vote, but 70% of these certified said, but do you know what? we also consider changing our vote. And basically, the funny story is that normally people say, oh, there is a drift from the mainstream to the insurgent parties. No, there is. Europe today looks like a kind of a major square of a city in which traffic light stop to work. And basically cars goes in all directions. So from this point of view, people are looking for change, but they can find change in a very different positions. For example, there was one of the last elections was, for example, you have an elections in Netherlands. There was regional elections in which a new anti-immigration party performed very well, and people said, Europe is moving to the right. And then next day, you have an elections, presidential elections in Slovakia, and Slovakia elected the most liberal progressive president ever elected in Central and Eastern Europe for the last 30 years, non-political woman who basically was a human rights activist, and people said, no, they're moving to the liberal side. And the third day, you have an elections in Spain, and here it's the problem of choice. What is more important, that the Socialist Party double its vote, which means the mainstream party regains support, or that the far-right party enter the parliament? So from this point of view, it's going to be very much, it's going to be also the war of interpretations, what happened on the night of the elections. But there are several countries that is worth watching. One is Bulgaria, because Bulgarian embassy is here, so watch Bulgaria. The second and very important country to watch is Poland. Poland politically at the moment is the European country that very much resembles electorally the United States. It's a very divided country. Basically, I was talking to the mayor of Warsaw, who had a panel of 10,000 voters before his elections, which happened some months ago, and trying to see in 6 months how they're going to change their vote. I mean, government versus the opposition. Out of these 10,000 people, only 2 persons changed their vote. So the dividing line between the government and the opposition is really like a front line. So Poland is very important because if the opposition is going to prevail in Poland, all the talk about Central Europe is changing dramatically. Because this idea that Central Europe is going liberal and so on, you're going to see that just one elections can have a very strong impact, because after European elections in Poland, you're going to have national elections in the open parliamentary elections and then presidential elections. And imagine for the moment that you're going to have the opposition-dominated government and, for example, President Tusk coming back and running for the president of Poland, then all the narrative is going to change dramatically. You're going to have somebody else here telling you the story why 1989, why the light is back. At the same time, you have Italy. Italy is, first, a very important European country, financially critically important because of the fate of the euro, but also Italy is politically very interesting because there the mainstream parties basically collapsed on a day. 67% of the population in Italy believes that nothing works, neither the national government nor the European Union.
It's like that traffic circle you were talking about.
Yeah, in their case, basically they're traffic circling for more than a day, yeah. At the same time, also Italy was interesting because in Italy now you have in government 2 different types of a populist mobilization and populist parties. One very much coming from the left, 5-star movement, which was very much based on some of the classical ideas of the anti-austerity movements, which means high participation of people, very much going through the internet, and so on, leaderless movements. And on the other, you have Mr. Salvini's League, which was very much empowered by the anti-immigration reaction of the public, with a very strong leader. Basically, the only thing that you know about the party is the name of the leader. I'm saying this because when you see this, you're going to see that, at least in the case of Italy, the right-wing populism is performing better. So from this point of view, how Italy is going to work, what is going to be the message out of Italy is going to be critically important. Germany is important because Germany is always important, but also because it's not so much about how much AfD is going to do, because to be honest, people, when they go to Germany, now everybody is fascinated with AfD. I don't believe that this is the major story. The major story is that if Social Democrats are going really to have a bad result, and if the Christian Democrats are not going to be happy with their result, we can easily end up with early parliamentary elections in Germany at the end of the year. And this is going to be a major thing. And of course, France is important because I'm not excluding, let's put it mildly, the situation in which Mrs. Le Pen is going to be the first political party. on these elections, which is going to have an important symbolic message because Mr. Macron so much positioned himself as kind of the visionary, the Europe that is going to come. But in order to understand really how complicated all this is, do you know that we asked the question, do you believe that European Union work? Do you believe that the national state work? Because many people believe that in Europe there's going to be a clash between the nationalists and Europeans, pro-Europeans. The biggest group, 38%, believes that neither European Union works, nor the nation state works. And among the supporters for Mr. Macron, more than 60% believe that European Union does not work. So they like the European Union in the way it could be, not in the way it is. At the same time, in Eastern Europe, which people are going all the time to talk about nationalism being on rise, Poland and Romania are the countries in which the biggest majority of people believe that European Union works and their national government does not work. Because people said, we like sovereignty, but we don't want to be left in one room with our own government. And I do believe this type of a much more complex understanding of what motivates people, where they go, is part of why the results of the elections are not going to be so easy to be interpreted. And this is my last point, so this European election is also important because psychology matters. And if you're looking at the TV screen, and if you have the feeling that all these Eurosceptical parties that you don't like much and that don't believe much in the European Union, if they're winning, if you're a politician, you're going to say, listen, could I bet all my money that European Union is going to stay for the next 15 years? Should I not have a policy to basically hedge against this? Not that I'm against, but I want to be sure that if something wrong going on, I'm not going to lose everything. The bad news is that if all 27 decided to hedge against the European disintegration, the risk of disintegration is going to increase dramatically. So, and this is my major kind of theoretical argument. The biggest risk of European Union is not a political revolution of the anti-European forces. This is not going to happen. The biggest risk is a crisis based like on a run on a bank, when people fearing that others don't trust the European Union enough start also to withdraw some of their support because they do believe that the Union is in crisis. On the other side, the good news is we like to talk about anti-Europeans, Eurosceptical, particularly in the countries that I know best in Central and Eastern Europe. There is not a single major politician that believes that his country is going to be better outside of the European Union. Many of them has a different idea how they can play better European Union for their own interest. But if somebody is going to tell you that Mr. Kaczynski or Mr. Orban wants the European Union to collapse or them to leave, don't believe them. Because most of these people and most of these regimes are benefiting from two things. Anti-European rhetoric on one level, but European funds on the other side. And you need both in order to flourish.
One quick last question, then we'll give the audience a chance to hit you with some questions. And you know, I don't want you to give away your, you know, the message of your book, your forward-looking message of your book, because then fewer people will buy it, and that's not a good thing. So without giving away too much, what's the forward-looking message in 25 words or less?
Yeah.
Just kidding on that.
No, listen, the book it's a very simple book. It's very much centered on imitation, and it gets 3 different stories. Basically, there are 4 chapters. We start with the problem of resentment and imitation, but also we said that there were different forms of imitation. Eastern Europe imitated with the idea to convert, basically to transform itself. It was genuine, it was strategic, to a great extent it was successful, but it produced resentment. And we tried to tell why. Russia imitated for a while in order to survive. You go and adopt institutions and so on, because in the 1990s it was in a very weak position. And then basically Russians said, we're imitating the wrong thing. It's not the institutions. We're going to imitate American foreign policy. And this is very important because it's like kind of a reverse engineering. And in the reverse engineering, quite often, you imitate something that does not exist. I'm just going to give you one example. Probably all of you have read the famous story about the Russian hybrid war doctrine of General Gerasimov. And General Gerasimov said that now there is a time for hybrid wars, and we should use information and so on and so on. And this is true. But the whole story is the following. Gerasimov said, this is what the Americans are doing. So this is what we should do. They're making color revolutions, we should make color revolutions on our own. So you start to imitate, but you start to imitate something that is in your head. It does not need to exist. But this is the problem with the imitation, and this is the Russian, the message of the Russian chapter. When you basically try and make imitation the major mode of reaction of your foreign policy, first of all, most of the time you don't understand what others are doing. I have spent quite a lot of time talking to the Russian decision makers. They're never going to see anything that Americans are doing as being a failure. For example, you're telling them Americans failed in Iraq, and they said, no, they didn't fail. This is what they wanted. To destabilize. In a certain way, failure is not an option. And as a result of it, basically, you start to escalate. And this escalation goes because it's a great extent escalation without a clear purpose. For example, one of the stories, people are saying, why exactly, basically, they decided to interfere in the American elections? Because it's a status issue. To be a great power, I should try to do it, everything that I do if you're doing to me. But as a result of it, many things are happening. And so from this point of view, imitation, and this was the Russian case, has far-reaching kind of foreign policy consequences. And then basically you have the United States, as I have an American co-author, and the question was, why those that have been imitated started to be unhappy with the law that imitates them? And from this point of view, I do believe that if President Trump was with us, he's going to say, if democracy and market are our competitive advantage, why we're giving it for free? Because in business, imitator could be your major competitor because he's stealing your competitive advantage. The last very short chapter, and there is somebody in the room that I even feel kind of fearful even saying that there is a chapter like this because we're not experts on China at all. But our last chapter was that China was never about imitation. For the Chinese was, they have been borrowing but never imitating. And trying to make the fact that you're not imitating anybody else kind of a major ideology of it. So from this point of view, we said, listen, we're in a different world. It does not mean that people, governments, and states are not going to imitate each other, but we're entering in the moment in which this one and only model that we see from 1989 is not there. So this is the story of the light, but the book is much better because there is a, because there is a co-author. And he's a really smart man.
I read the first chapter, so it's really good. At least the first chapter. He wouldn't send it any more of it to me. So we'll start over here. This gentleman had his hand up first.
Thank you for
Please keep your questions short because there's a lot of people.
Sure,
Yep.
definitely. So worldwide, nobody seems like communism. But I want to ask the panel, the guest speaker, is that as you know, in Europe, a lot of countries adopted socialism. Or you may not call that specifically, but what it has been done, a whole lot like what Karl Marx has described as the early part of early stage of communism. What's your comment on that? Is the EU move towards communism eventually?
Thank you for your question.
Listen, EU is moving in different directions, but communism is not one of them. And for very specific reasons. Of course, European societies are much more welfare and social states than many other in the world. If you're going to see the level of the social spending in particularly West European society, it's much higher, not simply than in the United States, in other places. But don't forget that in European Union, you have a lot of countries that have a real life experience with a much more radical version of socialism. So when it comes to nationalization of industries, when you come basically to this kind of a classical collectivist utopia, from this point of view, this is not the direction in which European Union is going. European Union is very much attached to its welfare state, and in my view, for very good reasons. The biggest problem for the Europeans is how we can afford this welfare state, particularly with the aging populations and trying to see how it's going to work. But no, I don't believe that this kind of a radical egalitarian, in a positive communist utopia is very much there. And also in Europe you have something, you have it also in the United States. Europeans are much more scared about this kind of big data governance that you see in other places. For example, don't forget that when it comes to social media, Europeans are much more trying to regulate than anybody else. Probably one of the reasons is that we don't have a big champions like China or the United States, but the other is basically the social score system like in China and so on. For Europeans, this is not something that attracts European publics on a normative level. This is not how we perceive the good society.
This gentleman here has a quick question.
Hey, Dave Onsbach, no affiliation. Has any determination been made about how to handle the border between Northern Ireland and Gibraltar and Spain? Thanks.
It's a good story. First of
You
all,
avoided the UK.
listen, UK is difficult. Of course, there's a lot of people thinking about this. I should confess I'm not one of them. But a huge issue. But I'm going to use this issue to make a much more kind of a broad argument for my own. At some point, people said if European Union is going to collapse, and this was kind of a classical nationalistic narrative, Europe is going to be back to the nation states as we know it. And then you start to understand that if something going wrong, there is nowhere to go back. For example, is Spain going to survive on its own without the European Union? What about the United Kingdom, in which basically you see how getting out of the European Union created a problem? And from this point of view, the Irish border is very much the synonym of this. On Gibraltar, I do believe a compromise was reached between the Spanish government and the British government and European Union. This is part of the deal that we have, but probably there is in the room somebody from the European delegation here who knows much more than me. UK is such a shock, and I should, particularly for East Europeans. There were two things that we have been taught from the very first day. And this is that we don't know are the Brits good or bad, but they're the smartest persons ever when it comes to politics. So the failure of the British elite to deal with Brexit is a really cultural shock. Cultural shock for everybody, nevertheless, where they stand in the debate about Brexit. And I do believe, unfortunately, the crisis of Brexit very much empowered this total mistrust to the political elites in general. Because the idea is, if the Brits cannot do it, if this what they're doing look as a soap opera, what you can expect from Bulgarians, Romanians, and others. And I do believe this is a major issue. So probably because of it, the Irish border is not something that haunts me all the time. Let's Brits decide it.
What else we got? We have a couple over here. This lady here, right next to you, Andrew.
Hi, thank you for coming and speaking. Do you see the EU growing and accepting member states in the near future? And if so, which states do you think are next?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question, and also not one to be answered easily politically today if you want to be really credible. As you know, the European Union has made a very strong commitment to some of the countries in the Western Balkans. So basically you can expect that the next should be the Western Balkan countries. At the same time, even seeing the last meetings in Berlin, you can see that electorally, I'll be surprised in the next 5 years how easy it is going to be for anybody to enter the European Union. This was part of the major impact of Brexit. Before Brexit, the question was who is coming next. After Brexit, the question is who is leaving next. So now, basically, we don't believe that somebody is leaving next, but we're not sure that somebody is coming next. And one of the problems with the migration crisis is European Union before was a very strange political actor. We were the only actor who is expanding borders. European Union was based on hard budgets and soft borders. In a certain way, we always said that we are bordering a future member. Be it Turkey, being Ukraine, being the Balkans. The problem with the migration crisis is in strengthening the borders is that in order to strengthen the borders, you should know where they are. So from this point of view, the nature, for example, of the Bulgarian-Turkish border is changing. The nature of the Polish-Ukrainian border is changing. And this is a difficult moment. And from this point of view, European Union, enlargement was the most successful and kind of, in a certain way, the most understandable policy of the European Union, but obviously in a short term of time, I do believe the European Union will try to find another ways to keep some of the countries nearby just joining the European Union at this very moment. Nevertheless, with what political leaders are saying, I'll be surprised in the 5 years if I see any country doing this.
Good evening. Thank you for the lecture. My name is Katerina. I'm from Ukraine. Recently, we had presidential elections with very strange result when comedian with no experience in public sector won the elections. What do you think about this? What does it mean?
Listen, from this point of view, Ukraine simply proved that it is a classical European country, which means that protest vote is the one that dominates. But from this point of view, we're going to something. I'm not a specialist on Ukraine, so in a certain way you're going to explain better than me, but there are three arguments. The first very much, by the way, being connected to what we have been talking before. Ukraine is a critical country because also the political choice very much defines the geopolitical choice of the country. Basically, this is much more contested area than others. And the first thing that not many people are discussing seriously is a lot of people also emigrating from Ukraine. If the levels of immigration continue, and if we basically imagine that 25% of the Ukrainian population is going to leave, seeing from which part of the Ukraine they're living, mostly Western Ukraine, what kind of people are living, mainly younger, better educated, this can end up with a totally different electoral body and totally different choices, which can also have geopolitical consequences. Secondly, people were very much inspired by the Maidan, and then basically they have been disappointed. And they have been disappointed by the political class as a whole, and they voted for somebody who had one major advantage. He was not part of the political class. I was much more trying to see it from also how it works from the Russian point of view. And in these elections, there is one good news and one bad news for Russia. The good news is that Ukrainians' heroic narrative of the war, epic war between the Ukrainian people and Russia, does not stand easily because when you're in a war, you don't vote for a comedian. You can vote for a crazy general, but you don't go for a comedian. But on the other side, I do believe Zelensky also very much represents something that Russia fears most. Strong protest vote that can be mobilized by anybody. By anybody, with no infrastructure behind it, no clear political ideas and so on. And this happens in politics. So from this point of view, I don't know. I don't want to make very early judgments. I remember an old Polish joke from the martial law period, which probably should be applied to Zelensky. And the joke is two Polish soldiers, it is 10 minutes to 10, are walking, as you know, during the martial law, everybody who is on the street after 10 o'clock, you should shoot to kill. And they see a person running. And one of them took his gun and shot him. And the other said, but why did you shoot? They're 10 minutes to 10. And the first one said, I know where he's living. He cannot make it in 10 minutes. So I don't believe that we should do the same with Zelensky. Let's give him 10 minutes and let's see what he can do.
One more quick last question. I thought we had somebody over on this side or not. And this gentleman here gets the last.
My name is Bojko Antonov, born in Bulgaria. And my question is about the mentality in Europe. Not so long ago, President Reagan said that, in his last speech, mentioned that you can go and work and live in Germany, but you will never become a German. You can go and live in France, but you will never become a French. But the Americans, everybody is welcome coming here and becoming American. With the European Union changing so rapidly, how do you see the change of mentality in this direction?
Listen, it's a very good question. And to be honest, it is changing a lot. I'm living for the last 10 years, most of the time in Vienna. The joke is that Vienna is the best place to live in Bulgaria. It's not far away. But also you can see that societies that used to be very much kind of a culturally totally homogeneous start to open themselves in a different way. For example, It's not like the United States, and it's never going to be like the United States. But on the other side, listen, it particularly, because people are moving within the European Union, it's very different. I don't want to compare basically my experience with the experience of a Syrian refugee that will go there. It's going to be unfair. But at the same time, if you go and walk to the universities of some of these European countries, you're going to be surprised how many foreigners you have. And how much in certain professional circles this is done and how it works. So from this point of view, European Union is very much changing the mentality of these small nation states. The difference is that it's changing the mentalities for some people and it makes it much more difficult for others. In biology, we know that normally when you see, imagine that basically you keep your hand between your eyes and one of your eyes sees something that is moving and the other something that is not moving. When you ask what you're seeing, you're going to report only the thing that is moving. Part of our understanding of what happened after 1989 was that we have been seeing only these people that have been moving and changing and doing this. But do you know that around, if I do believe that my statistics is right, but if I remember rightly, 40% of the population of France lives, works, and dies not far away than 40 kilometers from where it was born. So from this point of view, we try not to see some of these people. And for these people, the world is also changing a lot. And for me, this is very important to understand. One of my professors, Giuliano Amato, who was a very famous Italian politician, he was also Minister of Interior, probably 10 years ago in Italy. And he was reported about an old lady that for 5 years had never left her apartment in Rome. And she was living in one of these kind of a much more migration neighborhoods. So Amato went to visit her. And he said, old lady, why you are not leaving? Are people treating you badly and so on? And she said, no, son. I don't have any particular complaints. I'm not getting out because this is not my neighborhood anymore. The smell is different. People are nice, and they're not nice to me. I'm not complaining anything. But she said, it's different. Why I'm saying this? Because we're normally seeing how the world is changing for people that are moving. But for many people that are not moving, the world is changing too. And for these people, and part of these people you're going to see with the mobilization, with the yellow jackets and others, it's not simply about incomes. It's about suddenly you realize that you went nowhere, but everything around you has changed. But from this point of view, Europe, compared with the time when Reagan made his argument, is a different place. You can say worse or better, it's different. It depends where you stand politically, but it has changed a lot. And the very fact that you have a Bulgarian on May 9 speaking in Europe as a representative of the European Union, just go mentally 30 years back. And this is not possible. Imagine where the country was, how it was perceived, and the very fact that you really can have these people coming from a small East European nations coming and telling you what's going to happen in Germany or in Italy, probably wrongly telling you all this. But the very fact that you have this is an incredible change. And I do believe we own this change to the European Union.
Ivan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great job.